Hebrew, and I've always wanted to. I've never gotten around to it, but I thought, so far in my life, I haven't missed out on too many things because of this, until today, because I would have loved to be able to take part in this whole conference and listen to what I know have been very distinguished guests discussing a really urgent political moment in Israel, but sadly my Hebrew is not even at the level, it's just non-existent, so I wasn't able to do that. So I want to talk today about my last book, but given the situation in Israel at the moment, also about my penultimate one, which is to say about the specific challenge of how to build ethnically and religiously diverse democracies, but also the broader challenge of how to sustain liberal democracies in a moment of populist authoritarian challenge to them. So my reflection on this book started about 3 or 4 years ago when I was on book tour to promote The People versus Democracy, my book about the rise of populism. And the German edition had just come out. I was giving an interview about it on German TV. And before I grew up in Germany, I get a little bit nervous speaking in German on live interviews because I've done most of my academic work in English. And so I always feel like my when I make a mistake in German, I'm a native speaker, so I don't have an excuse, but I don't actually feel as secure in German as I do in English. And so the first question I was asked in this interview was about the causes for the rise of populism, not just in Germany, but in the United States and so many other established democracies around the world. And I said that there was broadly 3 causes of that. Firstly, economic stagnation, that in the post-war decades, we had this very rapid economic growth. The Wirtschaftswunder in Germany, the Trente Glorieuses in France, in so many countries, there was this tremendous transformation in the kinds of lives that people could lead within a short space of time. I've been thinking about it a little bit over the last 24 hours because for a few years of her life, my grandmother lived close to Herzliya. She was born in Lviv, which is now, of course, under attack from Russia. She grew up in Poland. She was thrown out in 1968 by the regime there, and she ended up coming to Sweden as just before her retirement in her 60s. She worked for a couple of years and then retired on a minimal state pension. And when I would go to visit her in the summers, she would sit in a minimal apartment provided to her by the Swedish state. And one time, every summer that I visited her, she would look around the apartment and sigh deeply and say, "Never in my life could I have imagined living the last years of my life in such luxury." So the minimum of what people had available to them in the 90s in Europe was unimaginable from the perspective of somebody who had been born 70, 80 years before that. But we no longer have that kind of experience of rapid economic progress. Today, most people feel that they've worked really hard over their lives, they don't have that much to show for it. That their kids may do even worse than them. And so that economic stagnation, I said, is one of the things that makes people more willing to engage in political extremes, to give extreme candidates a chance. The second reason for the rise of populism, I think, has to do with technological transformation. It has to do with the rise of the internet and of social media, with a way in which that's enriched our debates in some important ways, brought people from the margins and the fringes, people who've been historically marginalized into our political discourse, but also the way in which it makes it easier to spread hatred, to spread lies, to have extremist politicians organize themselves politically, the way in which it's reduced the role of gatekeepers and made it easier for extremists to partake in our political system. So that's the second reason. And then I started speaking about the third reason for the rise of populism. I said, we're also in many countries, in many democracies around the world, in the middle of a historically unprecedented experiment, that of turning largely mono-ethnic monocultural societies into more multi-ethnic ones. And I think that this causes real challenges and real problems. But ultimately, I think that we're going to be able to meet those. There's a bunch more questions in the interview. After the first question, I felt a little bit more confident. I felt like I had gotten used to speaking live in German again. I ended the interview. I heard from a few friends that it had gone very well. I went to an airport hotel, fell asleep, took a flight back to the United States the next day, woke up in America, we landed, I switched on my phone, and I had way too many notifications when I switched on the phone. I don't know if that's ever happened to you, but when you've had the phone for a while, you haven't looked at it for a while, and you look at it, and suddenly there's sort of 17 or 56 messages, you think something has gone wrong. And I realized something must have gone wrong. And so I started reading those notifications, and I realized that the term I had used, the great experiment, had set off a kind of firestorm, because it was interpreted by some far-right politicians and blogs and sort of media conglomerates as, Jewish Harvard academic Yasha Munk, I was teaching at Harvard at the time, admits that he and Angela Merkel are playing a great experiment on the German people. So that phrase that I'd used in the middle of the interview that I'd sort of forgotten about, the great experiment, was taken as a kind of confirmation of a conspiracy theory of the great replacement. And it was first sort of picked up on by a few blogs in Germany, and by the time I'd landed in the United States, it was written up in the Daily Stormer, the sort of American neo-Nazi website, which sounds which is about what you'd imagine from its name. And so I reflected on that phrase I'd used, the great experiment, and whether I'd misspoken somehow or whether there was something to what I meant. And I even looked up the word experiment in the dictionary. And what I found is that there's two different meanings to the word experiment. One is the one that you or some of your kids may have seen in a chemistry class in high school, where the teacher comes in and he throws sort of one liquid into another, and there's a little explosion. And hopefully that experiment is pre-planned, and hopefully he knows exactly what's going to happen. If he's just randomly throwing a couple of liquids into each other without knowing whether or not they're going to burn down the school, that's a problem, right? But there's also a different kind of meaning of experiment, which is the one that is familiar in the United States, for example, from the founding of the United States. The great experiment of democratic self-governance that the framers embarked on in the 18th century. And that is to say that under uncertain circumstances, you adopt a course of action that you think is going to have good results, but without having a recipe book, without knowing exactly what's going to happen, without knowing exactly what you need in order to succeed. That, of course, is the kind of meaning of a word experiment I had in mind, and that I think does describe very well the essential situation that many diverse societies around the world face today. Not all of them, and I'll come back at the very end to my sort of initial reflections on what is similar and what is different in Israel. But most democratic societies around the world have either, like the United States and Canada, been diverse from the start, but also had a very clear racial and religious hierarchy, which put one group at the top of society and allowed them to dominate everybody else. Or they have, like Germany, where I grew up, in many European societies, as well as societies from Japan to Australia, been reasonably homogeneous at the time of their founding, not had a lot of ethnic and religious diversity within them. And so what all of those societies are trying to do now doesn't have an obvious historical precedent. Trying to build these deeply ethnically and religiously diverse democracies that, because of immigration and other forms of demographic change, now contain people from all over the world in a much more extreme way than in the past, and try to treat each member of those societies as equals. Not try to say some of them are second-class citizens or not citizens at all, but actually try to integrate them fully into the society. And so what I talk about in my last book, in The Great Experiment, is why this is hard, some reasons to be optimistic about this, and some prescriptions for how that can succeed. And that's what I want to talk about today as well. So my goal is going to be, in the first part of the talk, to depress you a little bit by talking about the real difficulties of a great experiment. In the second part of the talk, to hopefully lift your mood at least a little bit by talking about some of the reasons why we should be optimistic about the prospects of success. And then in the third part, to lay out briefly some of the basic principles and ideals we need in order to make those societies succeed. I'll try to do that all quite briefly, both because I want to have a chance at the end to share some reflections about what's happening in Israel, and then obviously to have an exchange with you and to hear all of your questions. All right. So let's start with the difficulties. I teach now at Johns Hopkins University, which is a very diverse undergraduate student body. Only a clear minority of the population is white, and we have many international students from all over the world, as well as sort of American diversity within ethnic groups. And my students think of themselves as some of the most tolerant people in the history of the world. And in some ways, perhaps they are. But I play a simple game with them at the beginning of my lecture course. I ask them whether or not a hot dog is a sandwich. And they look at me a little confused, but they're argumentative folks, so eventually somebody makes an argument for why, of course, the hot dog is a sandwich, and somebody makes an argument for why, of course, the hot dog is not a sandwich. And I have them debate this for a few minutes. And then I ask them to play a simple distribution game in which they can give points to their fellow students who they now know to be a member of the people who do believe that a hot dog is a sandwich, or people who don't believe that a hot dog is a sandwich. And as it turns out, these super tolerant students start to discriminate against each other on the basis of this belief. In fact, they would rather have less money to take home themselves, as long as the people with false belief about this have even less money, than to have more money themselves but give their classmates who disagree with them more money than they themselves get. And that, I think, illustrates a very important and fundamental characteristic of human beings. Human beings are groupish. We're very, very quick to draw these boundaries of who is part of my group and who is part of that group over there. And often we are capable of treating members of our own group with great courage, sometimes with real altruism, risking our lives to defend members of our own groups. But we are also capable of treating people who are not members of our own group with great cruelty and sometimes with outright violence. And so I think the first difficulty that we have to think through when we try to construct these deeply diverse democracies is this fact of groupishness, is the ease with which we form groups, favor our own groups, but also discriminate against other groups. The second difficulty has to do with the fact that historically, the reasons why we have discriminated against each other have sometimes been seemingly arbitrary. They've sometimes consisted in things that are hard to explain in retrospect. I studied history, but I still don't understand fully the difference between Guelphs and Ghibellines and why it structured political contest in Italy for centuries during the Middle Ages. But most of the time, the lines of conflict between these different groups fall along the same set of ascriptive identity markers. Most of the worst wars and civil wars, forms of ethnic cleansing and genocide, are motivated by ethnic characteristics, racial characteristics, religious characteristics, perhaps sometimes cultural or linguistic characteristics. So we know that there is a set of human character traits that make it particularly easy to say, I'm part of this group and you're part of a different group, and I'm not going to owe anything to members of that other group. I'm entitled to treat them with disregard or even cruelty. And so that's the second difficulty of building a deeply diverse democracy, because there's just more resources for drawing those lines. It just becomes easier to say, well, I'm part of this group within society, and you're part of that group over there, and we don't owe each other anything. It becomes easier to dissolve the bonds of fellow solidarity within a country and within a state. The third difficulty is ironic for somebody like me who thinks that democracy is part of a solution to how we make progress in the world and how we ensure that people have a modicum of rights and a way of living decently. I'm a defender of democracy, but I think that one crucial aspect of democracy actually makes it harder to sustain diverse democracies, and we have to be clear about that as well. So here's the reason. If you are in a monarchy, in a dictatorship, in a military regime, in a kind of multinational empire, somewhere without democracy, how much political power you have doesn't depend directly on how many of you there are. So, you need to trust the monarch, I need to trust the monarch, and as long as we do, it doesn't really matter if you have more kids than I do, or there's more people coming into the society who look like you rather than like me. There's no direct link between demographics and power. In a democracy, you're always searching for a majority because of the electoral mechanism. And when you're searching for a majority, it obviously becomes much more threatening to say, well, we used to be in the majority, and so we used to dominate and have power. But now we're fearful that perhaps this group over there is having more kids, or this group over there has more immigrants coming into the society that resembles them rather than us. And so we have to put a stop to that. We have to find a way to make sure we're not going to lose that political power, because that's very threatening. That helps to explain why, by seemingly innocuous turn of phrase about the experiment, was seized upon by the far right in Germany in the way it was. And it helps to explain more broadly the sort of drivers of demographic fear that you have in so many different societies around the world today. So you take those three things together, the groupishness of human beings, the way in which ethnic and religious diversity can accentuate that, and actually the way in which democratic institutions can deepen the problem. And you see why the great experiment is, in fact, a perilous one, why the chances that it might fail are real. And I think we have to take those reasons to be concerned very seriously. Have I depressed you yet a little bit? Some polite nodding, yeah, okay. Now, I actually don't think that's a reason to despair. And part of the reason for this is that I've noticed a strange trend in how people think about this topic. I think a lot of the time people, perhaps less in Israel, but certainly in North America and Western Europe, start with a lot of optimism and perhaps a naive optimism about this subject. They say, well, look, how hard can it be to get along? How hard can it be to tolerate your neighbor? How hard can it be not to be a racist or not to be a bigot? And when we then look at their societies and they see that things are going seriously wrong in those societies, that there's injustices and so on, then it becomes very tempting for them to say, oh, look, if we're failing at this easy task, how can we possibly have any hope for the future? If we're failing at something that's so simple, then we really should despair, then we really should give up. And so what I'm doing in this project is sort of the other way around. I'm starting by pointing out why this is actually so difficult, and then trying from that to derive the argument for a hopefully well-founded optimism, a hard-won optimism about some of the progress we've made. And I think when you look today at most diverse democracies around the world, when you look at the United States and Canada and Germany and France and Sweden and Australia and other countries around the world, there is actually a lot of reasons to think that by comparison to the horrible ways in which diverse societies have often gone wrong in the history of the world, we are doing pretty well. part of that is just at the level of outright discrimination. One of the things that is striking is that within the lifetime of many people in this room, in the United States, 1960, for example, about 19 out of 20 Americans thought that it is morally unacceptable for a white and a black person to marry. 19 out of 20. According to opinion polls, 19 out of 20 now think that, of course, it is morally acceptable for white and black Americans to marry each other. So we've gone from a near universal rejection of this idea to a near universal acceptance of it. And some of that may be what social scientists call social desirability bias. Some of this may be that people no longer feel free to tell pollsters their true views on the subject when the phone rings. That in itself is probably a sign of progress too. But we know that there's been a real sociological change. So in America, about 1 in 33 newborns used to be multiracial, have a parent of a different ethnic group to each other. 1 in 33, as recently as about 30 years ago. It is now 1 in 7 or 1 in 6, depending on which statistic you look at. So it has gone from being quite rare to very, very common in the span, effectively, of a generation. I think this shows, at the most intimate level, the way in which people who did not think of each other as fully human, or who did not think of each other as in any way equals, are deciding to intertwine their lives with each other. But you see other intimations of that as well. In most European countries, according to the World Values Survey, you could have asked people in Paris or Berlin or Rome or Stockholm 40, 50 years ago, who is a real German, a real Italian, a real Swede? And they would have given you some version of the same answer, which is, well, somebody who comes from the same ethnic people, somebody whose grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents have already been part of more or less this geographic entity. Today, that has thankfully changed. A majority of people in each of these countries acknowledge that they can have compatriots who have roots in different parts of the world, who may have different religions, who certainly may have a different skin color, and so on. The condition of being considered a true compatriot has become linguistic facility and respect for the basic rules and norms of that society, a much more inclusive set of criteria. Perhaps the point where the pessimism is particularly fashionable in many diverse democracies, and where actually there's a strange confluence of pessimism from different parts of the political spectrum, but where it is also ultimately most ill-founded, is immigration, and in particular the kind of ability of immigrants to achieve socioeconomic progress. So on the far right, you sometimes hear that immigrants aren't succeeding, and that perhaps a lot of them are unemployed and abusing the welfare system, perhaps even that they're more likely to be criminals and to pose a danger to society. And the explanation for that is often ascribed to some kind of cultural or perhaps even biological inferiority. There's something about the stock population that makes them successful, and something about the culture or the perhaps origins of the immigrant population that makes them incapable of succeeding in those societies. I'm sure you've heard forms of that discourse. Now, many of my friends and colleagues in the Democratic Center or on the left rightly reject that description, rightly reject that attribution of blame, which is, of course, absurd. But they often echo a surprisingly similar pessimism, because what they tend to say is that it's really true that immigrants and their descendants aren't succeeding very well. It really is true that they are struggling to have socioeconomic success and so on and so forth. It's just that the reason for that is the racism and discrimination they face. And so it's sort of our own fault. But we should be equally pessimistic, just put the blame on the other foot. I think that is more plausible, actually, because there is real racism and discrimination in each of the societies that I've talked about. But that, too, is ultimately too simple, because we see, according to the OECD, for example, that the children and grandchildren of immigrants in virtually every OECD country have a much higher likelihood of experiencing socioeconomic mobility than with children and grandchildren of similarly situated non-immigrant ancestors. So you're seeing the gap between immigrants and non-immigrants close relatively rapidly. And in the United States, the best study with over 1 million data points shows that this is a slow process, that especially when you come from a country that is less affluent, has less educational mobility, less educational opportunity, you're not likely to reach the medium income in the new society, especially if you get there as an adult. And perhaps your children weren't either, but over time there's going to be real socioeconomic progress. And in fact, the speed with which the descendants of immigrants from Mexico and El Salvador and Vietnam and Nigeria integrate into American society and have success socioeconomically and educationally today is about the same as it was for Irish or Italian immigrants a century ago. Now, this obviously shows that the far right is wrong to say that there's something inferior about these immigrants. That's unsurprising. But it also shows that many of my friends and colleagues are wrongly pessimistic about their prospects for success. That it's wrong to think that non-white immigrants can't succeed because of the obstacles that are put in the way. The obstacles are real, but in fact, we know from studies that they are succeeding, and I think that's something that we should be optimistic about. So what kind of principles do we need in order to build a more thriving set of diverse democracies? I want to talk briefly about 3 points before I come back to speak to a local context here. The first is that we have to think carefully about what the fundamental values of our political system are. And I think of those as being liberal democracies, so as having an element of collective self-government, where we want to rule ourselves rather than allowing some dictator or some religious authority to do so for us. But secondly, as being individual freedom. These are liberal democracies, so we also want to ensure that people actually get to live a life that is, in some meaningful sense, self-determined. So what does that mean in practice when you have so much diversity? Well, I would say 2 things. The first is that there is an obvious threat to our freedom to be ourselves, to be true to our conscience, to be true to our religious beliefs, and so on, from the tyranny of a majority and from a tyrannical state. There's an obvious risk, which is particularly clear to Jews in the light of the history of the 20th century, of minorities being maltreated, excluded, and in most extreme cases murdered by the state acting on the behest of a majority ethnic or religious group. But there's also a second very important danger to individual liberty, which we sometimes don't pay enough attention to. And that is that historically, one of the big threats to individual freedom has come not in the form of a tyrannical state, but in the form of what Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson call the cage of norms. Has come in the form of what your own parents or aunties and uncles or neighbors or priests or rabbis or imams tell you about how you must live. And so I think to preserve that kind of freedom, our society needs to reject a majoritarianism, which says the majority gets to do anything it wants. It needs to reject a perfectionist liberalism, which basically says that everybody should live a kind of secular lifestyle, but everybody needs to be self-creating all of the time, because that doesn't understand the importance of religion and other kinds of cultural groups that will always persist. But we also need to reject a communitarian conception, which effectively reconceptualizes these diverse democracies as simply a group of groups, simply an association of associations, and then leaves the individual subject to the cage of norms, to the kind of tyranny that they might experience at the hands of their own community. What we need is a double freedom, a freedom from an outside majority that might want to impose its will on us, but also a freedom from our own community. So when we respect groups in a liberal society, it is as a function of a free choices that their members have made to invest these groups with meaning. It is not as structuring devices which determine your rights and responsibilities in society as a whole. The second point I want to speak to is about the kind of models of integration that you might have. This debate has particularly been led in the context of immigrant societies, but I think it's relevant more broadly. There's one kind of conception according to which we need to have a melting pot, right? In which we say, to deal with these diverse societies, we essentially have to homogenize them. The new culture will bear the hallmark of all the different kinds of influences that go into making it, but eventually citizens become quite undistinguishable from each other. I think that that's unrealistic because it doesn't give enough importance to the ways in which people always choose to identify with their religious beliefs, with their cultural heritage, with the way in which they invest groups in deep meaning. And it's an impoverished vision of what it will look like to live with each other. Now, on the other hand, I think you have the sort of counter model of something like the salad bowl or the mosaic. The model which says, look, we should think of society as a composite of these different kinds of groups, and they're just going to be living next to each other. And as long as they sort of keep the peace and perhaps eat at each other's restaurants from now and again, that's going to make things work. Now, I think that is also naive, because it is naive both about the ways in which those groups would start to constrain the options and the choices of individuals within them, but also about our ability to withstand stress points, our ability to have enough solidarity with each other, enough of a mutual identity, so that when something bad happens and people are trying to blame each other for that, those societies don't erupt into deep conflicts. So I think the salad bowl and the mosaic are also naive about what it takes for diverse societies to actually thrive. So I've suggested a third kind of model, which is that of a public park, because a public park, I think, expresses more clearly the set of options that should be available in a diverse society. In a public park, all of us can continue this conversation by continuing to talk about these topics, and we say we don't want to talk to anybody else, we don't want to meet anybody else. And that's one option you can make. But we might also go and encounter others and make new friendships, make new connections with those other people. Now, there's a few conditions here, right? One is that obviously there needs to be conditions of safety. You need to know that you can go to this park without having to worry. You need to know that you can speak to a stranger without being in danger. So you need to put background conditions into place that make that kind of exchange possible. And the second point is that it's very important for us to make sure that some people are building those connections, right? Each person can choose to stay among their own group, but if nobody in the park ever gets to know each other, ever has a kind of new encounter, then there's something about the park that is missing. And that, I think, describes diverse liberal societies very well. It's a perfectly legitimate choice in such a society to say, I'm deeply religious, I'm going to stay within the bounds of my own religious community, that is my priority, I'm not really going to be talking to other people very much. As long as you don't threaten anybody, as long as you obey the rules of that society, that is a perfectly legitimate set of choices. But if everybody does that, and you end up having a society composed of these rival groups that just have no interconnections, no connective tissues between them, that becomes very concerning. The third thing that I think we need to adopt as a kind of ideal is a form of inclusive patriotism. Now, the idea of patriotism as a German Jew does not necessarily come naturally to me. I spent a lot of my life thinking that we should overcome any kind of conception of patriotism or nationalism. But I think we've seen in the last years what it means and what it does when we leave the very resonant symbolism of a nation to the kinds of people who want to use it and exploit it for the worst kinds of effects. And so I defend a patriotism in my new book that is partially based on civic patriotism, it's partially based on a common set of political values and ideals, of a commitment to a constitution. But that's also a cultural patriotism, because I think actually all of these societies I'm talking about have, in a real way, a living, breathing, everyday culture which people from different origins share with each other. And I think, especially those of us who choose to go to political lectures on a Tuesday evening, have to realize that civic ideals alone are not going to provide a foundation for that kind of shared patriotism. We also need something that's more rooted in the lived experience of everyday people. And that, I think, is this dynamic, forward-looking, changing culture which actually bears the mark of its diversity already. So how does all of this relate to Israel? I'm not sure that I have an easy set of answers on this, and I'm sure that you and everybody else will push me a little bit on that in the question and answer session. But let me say a few things about it. The first is that the fundamental challenge to Israeli democracy is very similar to the fundamental challenge that we've seen to many other democracies, the United States and Brazil and Hungary and India and other places over the course of the last years. But I am perhaps a little bit more concerned right now in the Israeli case for the following reason, which is that Brazil's ability and America's ability to throw an elected authoritarian populist out of office after their first term was dependent in part on the number of veto powers this country had and its geographical diversity, which gave a lot of power to regional governors, to mayors of big cities, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that makes Israeli democracy a little bit of an outlier, and perhaps in certain respects more similar to Hungary than it is to Brazil or the United States, is first of all its political centralization, the lack of federalism, the lack of dispersal of political power across different regions, and secondly, the concentration of political power in one chamber of parliament. In the United States, to pass a law, you need to have a president sign off on it, you have to have a majority in the House, you have to have a majority in the Senate, and you have to have a Supreme Court that regards the law as being in keeping with the Constitution. In Israel, you need the Knesset and the assent of the Supreme Court, but actually the Knesset, by simple majority vote, appears to be able to change that and appears to be about to change that. And so then you effectively have a small number of legislators be able to run roughshod over all of the kind of protections we need, not to stop particular laws from passing or particular policies that might be unpopular, but to sustain the separation of powers and the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press and all of those other things that are needed in order for the people to be able to vote a democratically elected government out of office by democratic means at the next election, if that's what they choose to do. So that is one reason for real concern in this context. I think the other question is about how my reflections on ethnically and religiously diverse democracies apply in the Israeli case. And I think here you have two elements of the system that make this harder. The first is that you have demographic groups which I think are much more mutually mistrustful and hostile than is the case in most diverse democracies, in part because it is not a matter of one dominant group slowly being joined by a variety of other groups, but rather it is a few relatively clear-cut demographic blocks that don't think of themselves as having a shared origin or other kind of shared features. And then, of course, it is the even more thoroughgoing religious polarization in a society that has, a very large block that is deeply secular and a very large block that is extremely religious, and that do often lead parallel lives. So, going back to the kind of guiding ideals, I think the challenge in Israel is that it doesn't look at the moment as though that kind of shared civic and cultural patriotism has a base in the country. It doesn't feel at the moment as though you can go beyond a kind of salad bowl, beyond a kind of mosaic, to have a sense of really shared citizenship. But I think in the long run, for Israeli democracy to succeed, you do need to push on those fronts. You do need to create a society in which people will always be very different, in which the membership in different communities of religious conviction or communities of origin will always continue to structure how they live in important ways, but in which you are actually able to build some form of shared inclusive patriotism, in which you are actually able to build, not between every citizen and every other citizen, but between many citizens, an actual culture of shared learning, shared commercial activities, shared civic associational life, perhaps a little bit more sort of foundation of joint families, something that actually creates the connective tissues which can sustain diverse democracies. Because otherwise, the best you can hope for is a very uneasy modus vivendi, which will always remain extremely vulnerable to shocks and the possibility that society deteriorates in the kind of ways in which diverse societies so often have in the past. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Munk. We'll hold now a short session of Q&A, and I would like to invite Dr. Amichai Magen from Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy, and Strategy here at Rייכמן University to hold this Q&A.